In 2001, America was under attack. On September 11th, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center and brought the 2 towers to the ground. A 3rd plane hit the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C., and the 4th plane crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives, but their honored memory still lives over 20 years later. However, what is often forgotten is the events that followed just a week after the terrible attacks. Suddenly, people began getting sick with a disease that had not been seen for decades, leaving many to believe that the terrorist attack was still not over. Hey humans, it's Hannah. Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, I do videos on creepy and disturbing things. And today's video is going to be a little different because this is actually a collaboration with another channel called Night Crime. Today, he and I are going to be talking about the anthrax attacks of 2001. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to tell the first part of the story here, and then I'm going to turn it over to him and he's going to finish up the story for us today. Huge credit to Night Crime because he not only wrote this entire script, but did all the research for it, etc. And he is an amazing creator here on YouTube. So if you haven't already, please go subscribe to his channel, go watch some of his videos because they are really great.
Hello everyone, my name is Caden and I run a channel by the name of Night Crime. Hannah and I make very similar content, so I feel like if you enjoy her stuff, you also would enjoy mine. This case is absolutely fascinating and I feel like all of you are going to enjoy it deeply. Of course, I'd like to thank Hannah for bringing me on. This case is so exciting, so I'm not going to keep this going any further. Hannah, thank you so much for having me on, and let's hop into this case.
On October 2nd, 2001, 62-year-old photojournalist Bob Stevens arrives at a Florida hospital in the early morning hours with a roaring fever and somewhat delirious behavior. Initially, the doctors thought that he might be suffering from meningitis, an inflammation of the protective membranes covering the brain and the spinal cord. To confirm this diagnosis, the hospital's chief of staff and an infectious disease physician named Larry Bush headed to the lab to check Bob's test results. However, when Larry then looked at the spinal fluid sample under a microscope, he could not believe what he was seeing. Yet there they were, strings of bright purple rod-shaped bacilli, an organism that was so rare it had been seen in the United States less than 20 times in the last century. It was called Bacillus Anthracis. In other words, it was the bacterium that causes anthrax. If you don't know what anthrax is, and many people have at least heard of it, it's a very deadly disease that is typically found in livestock. However, occasionally it can be found in humans. You can become infected through inhalation, injection, or ingestion, and even contact with the skin, which if that's not terrifying, I don't know what is. While anthrax can actually be treated with antibiotics, if it's inhaled, it's almost always fatal unless it's caught extremely early. And what makes this harder is that the disease can show up within a week of being exposed, but it also might not show any symptoms until like 2 months later. The patient will begin to feel chest pain, fever, shortness of breath, just like Bob Stevens did. And in this case of inhalation anthrax, if the infection has time to travel to the lymph nodes and then to the lungs, death can occur within 48 hours. And still, the potential deadliness of this disease was not even the scariest part of this situation. Due to how rare anthrax is and the fact that it cannot be transferred from human to human, Dr. Larry Bush knew that if his suspicions were confirmed, they were dealing with bioterrorism. And 2 days later, they took another spinal fluid test just to be sure, but it confirmed their worst fear. Bob Stevens was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax, which was the first case in over a quarter of a century in the United States. Immediately after the revelation, an emergency press conference was held by physicians to inform the public that there was a proven case of anthrax in Florida. However, even though it was extremely unlikely, it was reported that the patient might have contracted infection in the woods, quote unquote. In addition, the possibility of an outbreak was quickly dismissed by the U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy G. Thompson, who said, quote, "It's an isolated case, and it's not contagious. There is no terrorism." Still, since this was happening only 23 days after the collapse of the Twin Towers, the fear of another attack began to rear its ugly head. Sadly, on October 5th at 4 p.m., Bob Stevens passed away, becoming the first known anthrax fatality in the United States since 1976. However, even worse, Bob had not been patient zero. He was only the first to be diagnosed. Everyone else that would be diagnosed just didn't know it yet. They did an autopsy on Bob Stevens and were able to confirm that indeed he had the most fatal type of anthrax poisoning. Parts of his body had been turned blue due to the lack of oxygen, and his brain tissue showed to be swollen and hemorrhaged. So unfortunately, it probably wasn't the most peaceful of passings. Meanwhile, the investigation still was giving them no answers as to how the spores got into Bob's body and where these spores originally came from. Although officials had initially speculated that he had first gotten ill by drinking out of a tainted stream in North Carolina, there was kind of a big problem with this theory. Inhalation anthrax, which is what Bob passed away of, had to be literally inhaled. There's no way he got it from drinking water. So in the end, nobody knew where this disease had suddenly appeared from. And then, unlike the flu, which kills tens of thousands of Americans each year, there had been only one fatal case of anthrax in the past few decades. So how on earth had Bob Stevens acquired such a rare disease that up until this point had mostly left humankind alone? So of course, the media and reporters that were feeding off of Bob's tragedy began to speculate that he had fallen victim to a deliberate attack. If proven true, this would be the first documented case of anthrax being used as a murder weapon. However, it was still believed and most likely hoped at the time that Bob had somehow weirdly come in contact with the spores in his travels in the last 60 days. And so 3 teams went to go and investigate the locations where he was at. One group traveled to Chimney Rock. The second group covered Bob's favorite fishing spots. And the third went to his home and turned it inside out. Yet nothing came out of this investigation. And so the Center for Disease Control, aka the CDC, decided to go to Bob's office at American Media and start to investigate there. While medical detectives had initially ruled out that anthrax could have been spread in the office as they did not find any spores inside the air vents, the second time around proved otherwise. The CDC took away items in their lab for testing, including office mail slots, mail cubicles, and Bob's keyboard. Results soon confirmed that they had finally hit the jackpot as swabs collected from Bob's keyboard and the mailroom items tested positive for Bacillus Anthracis. Soon after, the CDC found out that another AMI worker named Ernie Blanco had developed symptoms from pneumonia and was at a local Miami hospital. Tests quickly proved that Ernie, too, had been exposed to the deadly spores. And so it seems that they had pinpointed the location of where Bob's fatal illness had originated. But this discovery only caused more questions than answers. How did anthrax spores end up in the America Media office, and why? As the first case of bioterrorism in the US seemed to become more and more plausible, and of course the public anxiety was increasing rapidly, the Anthrax Tax Force was then formed. It had members of the FBI, US postal inspectors, members of the CDC, and of course local police. One of the main issues was the fact that for anthrax to be inhaled and enter into the lungs, it had to be aerosolized, meaning the size of the pores had to be extremely small. However, it had already been ruled out that the air vents in the America Media building had not been used to spread the disease. Meanwhile, as specialists were still trying to figure out how these spores got into the America Media building, more employees then started to test positive for anthrax spores in their noses. One of these victims was a woman named Stephanie Daly, who had worked in one of the office mailrooms with Ernie, the previous victim. With all these pieces falling into place, a new theory materialized. What if these spores had been sent in a letter. The idea, of course, was terrifying. Anybody, anywhere in the nation could open a letter and unknowingly inhale organisms that were smaller than red blood cells. Unfortunately, as the spores were then being discovered at post offices, a terrible realization hit the entire nation. We were still under attack. All right, that is gonna be it for me. To hear the rest of this just nutty story, please keep listening, and here is Night Crime to continue this investigation.
The massive investigation that initially spun off from Bob Stevens' diagnosis eventually discovered that there were 9 other people before him that had been infected, but with less severe symptoms. However, there were also 4 more people that had died from the disease that sickened another 17. This sent 30,000 people to the doctors, 10,000 of which had to be put on preventative antibiotics, all just from using the United States Postal Service. While authorities never discovered anthrax tainted letters in Bob Stevens' office, they did discover them in other places. By early November, the FBI had 3 letters containing anthrax spores in their hands, including those sent to the offices of Senator Tom Dashley in Washington, D.C., the New York Post, and NBC in New York City. The public fury only intensified when it was reported that the first batch of these letters, including one to American media, had been sent from a mailbox in New Jersey on September 18th of 2001, a week after the 9/11 attacks. The second batch of letters is believed to have been mailed on October 9th to Senators Tom Dashley and Patrick Leahy with the fake returning address. In addition to anthrax spores, they received a note with the following message: 9/11/01. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. Similar notes were also found inside the letters sent to the New York Post and NBC News, which read, 9/11/01. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. Interestingly enough, both letters were actually written in different types of handwriting. And another thing, the Senate's letter has punctuation, while the media letter doesn't. On top of all of that, all of these notes were just photocopies. None of these were originals. And to this day, the originals haven't even been found. Unsurprisingly, the FBI was initially pressured to publicly blame Al-Qaeda to be responsible for the anthrax attacks. However, there was absolutely nothing that could link Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to these spore attacks. Absolutely nothing at all. And I imagine that explanation probably would have been readily accepted. I mean, it only makes sense. You physically attack, now biochemical weapon. But as investigators began to find no link between Al-Qaeda and the anthrax attacks, the FBI basically had to look elsewhere. By mid-2002, Dr. Stephen Hatfill, who had worked in the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, was named a person of interest in the case. However, Dr. Hatfill firmly maintained his innocence and was eventually cleared. The next target was another scientist by the name of Dr. Bruce E. Ivins. This was a person who had worked in the same institute and had been developing an effective vaccine against the anthrax. This time, the authorities were so sure that they had found their guy that in August of 2008, the Department of Justice and the FBI announced a breakthrough and released the documents and information showing that charges were about to be brought up to Dr. Ivins. While this evidence did seem damning, it was actually never brought to a courtroom. Now, I bet you're thinking, how is this possible? You have all of this evidence. What happened? On July 27th of 2008, Dr. Ivins took his own life by overdosing on Tylenol. Soon after, on August 6th, U.S. Attorney Jeffrey A. Taylor gave a statement naming Dr. Ivins sole culprit in the 2001 anthrax attacks. According to Taylor, before his death, Dr. Ivins had submitted false anthrax evidence to throw investigators off his trail, was unable to adequately explain his late laboratory working hours around the time of the attacks, tried to frame his coworkers, had immunized himself against anthrax in early September of 2001, was one of more than 100 people with access to the same strain of anthrax used in the killings, and had used similar language in an email to that in one of the anthrax mailings. In February of 2010, the FBI officially closed the investigation. After almost a decade, a 92-page report was published by the FBI pointing to the fact that Dr. Ivins had acted alone in the anthrax attacks of 2001. However, many people have questioned the results to this day. According to the study of the National Academy of Sciences in 2011, the FBI's investigation reportedly doesn't prove Dr. Ivins' guilt. Furthermore, a 2014 report by the Governmental Accountability Office found that the scientific method that the FBI used to basically identify their culprit was faulty, to say the least. Still, despite all of the loose ends and all of the unanswered questions, officially, the bizarre case of the anthrax attacks of 2001 remains solved and closed.